Happening in just a matter of hours today, a North Mississippi man is set to die by lethal injection for killing his wife. This is the first execution in our state in 9 years. David Neal Cox is set to die by lethal injection for the 2010 killing of his wife, Kim Kirk Cox. He also pleaded guilty to other crimes, including sexually assaulting his then 12-year-old stepdaughter in front of her dying mother. Stepdaughter Lindsay Kirk is now 23 years old. She told WTVA Cox is evil and she will be present at that execution today.
"I'm going to kill her when I get out." David Cox said those words over and over during the 9 months he spent in jail. He told his cellmates, he told anyone who would listen. He wasn't joking. He wasn't letting off steam. He was making a promise. 11 years later, on November 17, 2021, David Neal Cox was brought into the death chamber at Parchman Prison in Mississippi. He was 50 years old. He had spent 9 years on death row, but unlike most prisoners waiting to die, he had asked to be there. He had given up his right to appeal and asked the state to kill him. In a few minutes, Mississippi would do exactly that. At 6 p.m., prison workers began the lethal injection. 3 drugs flowed through tubes into his arms. The first to put him to sleep, the second to stop his breathing, the third to stop his heart. Witnesses watched through a window as the drugs did their work. Cox wore a red prison jumpsuit under a white sheet. He was strapped to a flatbed with his arms stretched out. Before the injection started, the warden asked if he had any last words. David spoke calmly. "I want my children to know that I love them very much and that I was a good man at one time. Don't ever read anything but the King James Bible, and I want to thank the commissioner for being so kind to me." And that's all I got to say. He took a few deep breaths as the drugs entered his body. His mouth moved a little. Then he went still. At 6:12 p.m., 12 minutes after the injection started, a doctor checked for signs of life and found none. David Neal Cox was dead. He was 50 years old, 2 weeks away from his 51st birthday. Cox was the first person put to death in Mississippi in 9 years. He was the 18th person to die by lethal injection in the state since 2002. Among the witnesses watching through the glass was 23-year-old Lindsay Kirk. She was 12 years old the last time she saw her stepfather as a free man. That night, he killed her mother and raped her 3 times while her mother bled to death on the floor. Now she watched him take his last breaths, hoping to feel something like peace. Cox was put to death for crimes that happened on a warm spring evening in May 2010. Sherman, Mississippi. The town was small and quiet. Everyone knew their neighbors. In a little house on a quiet street, a 40-year-old mother of 3 was making dinner with her sister while her children played nearby. Kim Cox had run there to get away from her husband. He had been abusing her daughter for years. Kim had told the police. She had gotten a court order to keep him away. She thought she was safe. She was wrong. David had spent 9 months in the Pontotoc County Jail waiting for trial. He was charged with sexually abusing his stepdaughter Lindsay for years. Police had also found materials used to make methamphetamine in his home. His bail was set at $200,000, far more than he could afford. Those 9 months changed nothing about David Cox, except to make him angrier. David talked about killing Kim to anyone who would listen. He told his cellmates exactly what he planned to do when he got out. He described it in detail. He said he wanted to kill Kim's father Benny first, then her stepmother Melody, then her sister. After that, he would go to Sherman and finish up and kill the rest of them. These weren't angry words spoken in the heat of the moment. He said them over and over, day after day, for 9 months. 9 months of making threats, 9 months of planning revenge. Then a judge lowered his bail, and he walked free. On May 14, 2010, his first move was to buy a .40 caliber handgun with extra bullets. His second was to borrow a van from his sister. His third was to drive 30 minutes to Sherman. At about 7:00 p.m., he walked up to his sister-in-law's house, raised his gun, and fired through the screen door. Kim was shot twice, once in the arm, once in the stomach. The stomach wound would kill her without surgery. David knew this. For 8 hours, the nightmare went on. One man holding his wounded wife and 2 children while dozens of police surrounded the house. They begged him to let Kim go so doctors could help her. He said no. "I want to watch her die," he told them. And he did. He called family members all night, taunting them, making them listen to Kim beg for help. He raped his stepdaughter 3 times while her mother lay bleeding a few feet away. He made Kim watch. When her father Benny finally got through on the phone, Kim could only say 5 words. "Daddy, I'm dying." At 3:23 a.m., a SWAT team broke down the door. They found David standing calmly near his wife's body. Kim Cox had bled to death on her sister's floor. She had been awake for most of those 8 hours. She knew no help was coming. She knew she was going to die. David didn't try to run. He didn't fight back. He smiled and said, "I told everyone I was going to do it." But the horror didn't end with Kim's death. There was a twist. David had committed another murder that would come to light too late. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. David Neal Cox Sr. came into this world on November 30th, 1970, in the rural heartland of Mississippi. He was born into a working-class family in a state that consistently ranked among the poorest in America. The Mississippi Delta region where he spent his early years was a land of cotton fields. For families like the Coxes, life was defined by hard work and modest expectations. There were no grand ambitions, no dreams of college or professional careers. You worked with your hands, you provided for your family as best you could, and you hoped the next generation might have it slightly better than you did. This was the world David Cox entered, and it would shape him in ways no one could have predicted. Details about David's childhood remain largely undocumented in public records. What we know is that he grew up during a time when rural Mississippi was still finding its footing after the upheavals of the Civil Rights era. He completed his schooling in local institutions, receiving the basic education available to children in small communities. David had siblings who would remain part of his life into adulthood. To them, David was simply family. A brother who attended gatherings and maintained the casual relationships common in rural communities. Nothing about the young David Cox suggested the capacity for brutality that would eventually emerge. After finishing school, David found his way into the trucking industry. Commercial truck driving was a common occupation in Mississippi, offering steady work and decent pay for men without advanced education. The job kept drivers on the road for long hours, traveling the highways that connected small southern towns to larger cities. For David Cox, it became his primary profession and provided the income he needed to support himself. The trucking life suited him for a time. He earned enough to get by and eventually to start thinking about building a family. But at some point during these years, David injured his back. The injury was serious enough to end his trucking career permanently and qualify him for disability payments. This transition from working man to someone dependent on government checks marked a significant turning point in his life. Without the structure of regular employment, David's days took on a different rhythm. He had more time at home, more idle hours to fill. David also developed a drug problem during this period. When police eventually searched his home in 2009, they found precursors used to manufacture methamphetamine. The drugs added another dimension to the portrait of a man whose life was slowly unraveling beneath its surface of normalcy. But all of that was still in the future. First, David Cox would meet a woman named Kim Kirk, and his path toward destruction would truly begin. David Cox met Kim Kirk sometime in the early 2000s. The exact circumstances of their meeting are not documented in available records, but what we know is that Kim was a young mother with a daughter named Lindsay from a previous relationship. She was looking for stability, for a partner who could help her build a complete family for her child. David seemed to offer that possibility. Kim Kirk was born on January 12, 1970, making her almost exactly the same age as David. She had grown up in northern Mississippi under the guidance of her father, Benny Kirk, a man who spent his career in law enforcement. Benny had seen the worst of human nature through his work, and he tried to instill caution and good judgment in his daughters. Kim's stepmother, Melody, helped raise her in a household built on family loyalty and mutual support. Kim had a sister named Christy Salmon, who became her closest confidant. The two sisters talked regularly, helped each other with childcare and household tasks, and maintained the kind of bond that only siblings who grew up together could understand. Christy lived in the small town of Sherman, Mississippi, close enough to see Kim regularly, but far enough to have her own separate life. When David entered Kim's world, she saw an opportunity to give Lindsay something the girl had been missing: a father figure. Kim believed that a complete family would benefit her daughter. When David expressed willingness to adopt Lindsay legally, it seemed like a sign of his commitment. The couple married and settled in Pontotoc County, Mississippi, a rural area in the northeastern part of the state. Pontotoc County had a population of roughly 30,000 people spread across small towns and unincorporated communities. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and families had lived for generations. For Kim, it meant staying close to her parents and sister, maintaining the family connections that mattered so much to her. David legally adopted Lindsay, becoming her stepfather in the eyes of the law. The couple then had 2 sons together. With 3 children in the household, the Cox family appeared to be a typical working-class Mississippi family. They had their struggles with money, especially after David's back injury forced him onto disability. But they managed to get by. The family had connections throughout the region that would later prove important. Kim's parents, Benny and Melody Kirk, lived close enough to be involved grandparents, attending school events and family gatherings. David's sister Charlotte Houston and brother-in-law Michael Houston also lived nearby. David borrowed vehicles from them when needed and maintained casual family relationships. Neighbors Hilda Smith and Raymond Smith considered David their close friend. They saw him around the property, talked with him about everyday matters, and had no reason to suspect anything unusual. To everyone who observed the Cox family from the outside, they seemed perfectly normal. But behind closed doors, a nightmare was unfolding. David had begun sexually abusing his stepdaughter Lindsay. The abuse started when the girl was young and continued for years, always happening when Kim was away from the house. David waited for opportunities when he could isolate his stepdaughter without risk of discovery. He threatened to kill Lindsay and her mother if the secret ever got out. For Lindsay, the home that should have been her safe haven became a place of constant terror. And the woman who loved her most in the world had no idea what was happening under her own roof. Kim worked hard to provide for her children while managing a household with 3 kids of different ages. She cooked meals, helped with homework, attended school functions, drove children to activities, and did all the countless things mothers do without expecting acknowledgement. What Kim did not know, what she could not have imagined, was that her husband was systematically destroying her oldest daughter's childhood. The abuse David inflicted on Lindsay happened precisely when Kim was away from home. He had constructed his crimes carefully to avoid detection, timing his assaults for moments when Kim was at work, or running errands or doing any of the tasks that took her away from the house. Kim saw only the husband she had chosen, the man who had adopted her daughter and fathered her sons. She trusted David because she had no reason not to. The deception was complete, and Lindsay's silence, enforced by threats of violence, kept the truth hidden for years. But secrets have a way of surfacing eventually. The carefully constructed facade that David had maintained would not last forever. Before it crumbled, however, the family would live through years that appeared ordinary to everyone, watching from the outside. Years during which David's hidden life grew darker and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Those years between David and Kim's marriage in the early 2000s and the summer of 2009 passed without incident as far as the outside world could tell. The Cox family occupied their home in Pontotoc County, Mississippi, raising 3 children and maintaining connections with extended family throughout the region. Holidays came and went. Birthdays were celebrated. The children grew older. Nothing about their external circumstances suggested the darkness hidden within their walls. David collected his disability payments after the back injury that ended his trucking career. Kim managed the household and cared for the children. Lindsay attended school and tried to live a normal life, despite what she endured whenever her mother left the house. The 2 boys grew up unaware of their sister's suffering, experiencing childhood in ways that Lindsay was denied. But David was living a double life that extended beyond the abuse of his stepdaughter. He was constantly on drugs. There was also an unsolved mystery that had touched the extended family 2 years earlier. In July 2007, David's sister-in-law Felicia Cox had disappeared under strange circumstances. Felicia Warren Cox was 40 years old in the summer of 2007. She lived in Piney Grove, Mississippi, with her husband, who was one of David Cox's brothers. Through their marriages to the Cox brothers, Felicia and Kim had become sisters-in-law, but their relationship had grown into genuine friendship. The 2 women talked regularly, visited each other's homes, and supported one another through the ordinary challenges of daily life. Felicia had a daughter named Amber, who had just turned 18 in 2007. Amber Miskelly was beginning to find her own way in the world, transitioning from teenager to young adult. Felicia had raised her daughter with love and dedication, and now she was watching Amber start to build an independent life. It should have been a time for Felicia to enjoy the rewards of motherhood, to look forward to the years ahead. On July 2, 2007, Felicia made plans to visit Kim at her home in Pontotoc County. The purpose was simple. Felicia needed a ride to the Oxford jail, where her husband was incarcerated at the time. She asked Kim to drive her, the kind of favor that family members do for each other without thinking twice. Kim agreed to help her sister-in-law. But when Kim arrived at Felicia's home to pick her up, Felicia was not there. This was unusual and concerning. Felicia had made definite plans, and she was not the type to forget commitments or change her mind without giving notice. Kim searched for her sister-in-law, eventually driving to her own house in Pontotoc County, expecting to find Felicia waiting there. At the Cox residence, Kim found only David. He was the last person known to have seen Felicia alive. David offered no clear explanation for where Felicia had gone or why she had failed to keep her plans. The situation felt wrong to Kim, but she had no evidence of anything more than confusion. After searching further and finding no trace of Felicia, Kim filed a missing persons report with the Pontotoc County Sheriff's Department. Investigators found Felicia's car abandoned on Waldo Road in Randolph, an unincorporated community in Pontotoc County. The vehicle was locked, and inside police found Felicia's purse and her pain medication. That detail struck Amber Miskelly as particularly significant. Her mother never went anywhere without her medication. The fact that it was left behind strongly suggested that Felicia had not departed voluntarily. David Cox immediately became the primary suspect in Felicia's disappearance. He had been the last person to see her alive, and his account of events left troubling questions unanswered. Investigators interviewed him multiple times, searching for inconsistencies or admissions that might reveal what had happened. But without physical evidence, without a body, and without witnesses, prosecutors had nothing they could take to court. For Amber Miskelly, the uncertainty became a prison of its own. At 18 years old, barely an adult, she was left not knowing whether her mother was alive or dead. She could not properly grieve because there was no confirmation of death. She could not move on because hope, however faint, remained possible. The not knowing stretched on month after month, year after year, a wound that could never fully heal. Life in the Cox household continued as if nothing had happened. Kim mourned her missing friend, but had no evidence to connect her husband to the disappearance. David maintained his facade of normalcy, attending family gatherings and going about his daily routine. Whatever he had done to Felicia, he kept that secret locked away while continuing to abuse his stepdaughter behind closed doors. As 2009 approached, Lindsay was nearing her 11th birthday. She had carried her terrible secret for years, a burden that no child should ever bear. But that summer, something would change. The summer of 2009 started like any other for the Cox family. School let out in late May, and the children transitioned to their summer routines. 11-year-old Lindsay went to stay with her grandparents, Benny and Melody Kirk, a normal arrangement that had occurred in previous years without any special significance. Being at Mama and Papa's house meant being away from the place where Lindsay had suffered for so long. The Kirk home represented safety, warmth, and unconditional love. There were no moments of dread when grandmother left the room, no constant vigilance watching for signs that she might be left alone with danger. For Lindsay, the distance from David provided something she desperately needed: space to breathe and think clearly about her situation. The days at her grandparents' house passed peacefully. Lindsay could be a normal child there, playing and relaxing without the weight of fear pressing down on her. One day during that visit, she picked up her phone and composed a text message to her mother. Through those typed words, she revealed years of sexual abuse by her stepfather. She told Kim what David had been doing during all those times when Kim was away from home. She shared the terrible secret she had kept locked inside for so long. The text message was a deliberate choice. Speaking the words out loud might have been impossible. Looking her mother in the face while describing what had happened would have required a kind of courage that even many adults could not muster. But typing the truth into a message allowed Lindsay to communicate the unspeakable without having to say it. The message could carry the weight she had been bearing alone. Kim Kirk Cox received the text, and her response demonstrated everything about who she was as a mother. There was no hesitation, no denial, no attempt to minimize what her daughter had revealed. Kim believed Lindsay immediately and completely. Her maternal instinct recognized the truth in her child's words, and every other consideration became secondary. Kim contacted the police without delay. She reported her husband's crimes against her daughter, knowing full well what that report would mean for her marriage and her family. Deputies from the Pontotoc County Sheriff's Department arrived to investigate the allegations. Kim had made her choice. Protecting Lindsay was more important than anything else. When deputies searched the Cox home, they found more than evidence of child abuse. They discovered precursors used to manufacture methamphetamine. David had been making or preparing to make illegal drugs in the same house where his children lived. The discovery added additional charges to the growing list of crimes against him. In August 2009, David Neal Cox was arrested. The charges included statutory rape, sexual battery, child abuse, possession of methamphetamine precursors, and possession of methamphetamine. He was transported to the Pontotoc County Jail, where bond was set at $200,000. For the first time since the abuse began, Lindsay could sleep without fear. Kim filed for divorce immediately, beginning the legal process of separating herself from the man who had betrayed their family so completely. She obtained a restraining order against David, a legal document prohibiting him from contacting or approaching her or the children. She was taking every step available to protect her family from the man she now knew to be a monster. But David Cox was not finished with them. Unable to post the high bail, he sat in the Pontotoc County Jail with nothing to occupy his time but his own festering resentment. In his twisted mind, Kim and Lindsay had betrayed him. They had destroyed his life by reporting his crimes. As the months passed, his anger grew into something far more dangerous than anyone realized. David Cox spent 9 months in the Pontotoc County Jail between August 2009 and April 2010, Unable to raise the $200,000 required for bail, he remained incarcerated while awaiting trial on charges of statutory rape, sexual battery, child abuse, and drug offenses. The legal process moved at its own pace, and David had nothing but time on his hands. A different man might have used those months for reflection. He might have confronted what he had done to Lindsay, acknowledged the harm he had caused, perhaps even felt remorse for the years of abuse. But David Cox was not capable of that kind of self-examination. Instead, he focused every ounce of his attention on revenge. In David's mind, he was the victim. Kim had betrayed him by calling the police. Lindsay had betrayed him by telling the truth. His imprisonment was their fault, not the natural consequence of his own criminal actions. This distorted thinking allowed David to nurture his anger without any moderating guilt. He was righteous in his rage. David talked about his hatred for Kim to anyone who would listen. His cellmates became unwilling audiences to detailed fantasies of violence. He told them explicitly and repeatedly that when he got out of jail, he would kill his wife. These were not vague expressions of frustration or momentary outbursts that faded with time. They were stated intentions, plans he described with chilling specificity. The threats extended beyond Kim. David told inmates he wanted to kill other members of her family as well. He mentioned her father, Benny Kirk, her stepmother, Melody, her sister, Christy. His plan, as he later revealed, was to eliminate everyone he held responsible for his arrest before finishing with Kim herself. The scope of his intended violence was staggering. While David sat in jail planning murder, Kim worked to rebuild her life. She moved out of their Pontotoc County home and relocated with the 3 children to live with her sister, Christy Salmon, in Sherman, Mississippi. Sherman was a small town in Union County, about 20 miles northeast of Pontotoc. Kim believed that distance would provide safety. She obtained a restraining order, that piece of paper that legally prohibited David from coming near her or the children. She filed for divorce, formally ending the marriage to the man who had abused her daughter. She did everything the system told her to do, following all the proper steps to protect her family. But restraining orders only work against people who respect the law. For 9 months, the Cox and Kirk families experienced a kind of peace. Lindsay began the long process of healing from years of abuse. Then, in early 2010, circumstances changed. David's bail was reduced, making it possible for him to secure release. He had not stood trial. He had not been convicted. The charges against him remained pending, but the legal system had released him to await further proceedings. Kim learned that her husband was free, and her fear returned with crushing force. The man who had threatened to kill her was out, and nothing but a piece of paper stood between them. Immediately after his release, David returned to work as a commercial truck driver. Despite his back injury and disability status, he found employment that gave him both income and mobility. The job put money in his pocket and kept him moving, resources he would need for what he planned to do. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like David was trying to rebuild his life. In reality, he was preparing for murder. Kim knew David was out. The news terrified her, but she believed the restraining order would provide some measure of protection. She stayed at her sister Christy's house in Sherman, keeping the children close and maintaining vigilance. She had done everything right, reported the abuse, obtained legal protection, moved away from their shared home. The system was supposed to keep her safe. In the days following his release, Kim encountered David at an intersection. Their vehicles stopped near each other, close enough for Kim to see her estranged husband clearly. What she witnessed chilled her to the bone. David held up his hand in the shape of a gun and pointed it at her 3 times, mimicking the act of shooting. The message could not have been clearer. Kim told her family about the encounter. Everyone understood what the gesture meant. David was not trying to reconcile or move on with his life. He was promising violence. But there was little anyone could do beyond what had already been done. The restraining order was in place. The police knew about the situation. Kim and her family could only hope that legal prohibitions would be enough. The weeks between David's release and May 14, 2010, passed in a state of anxious waiting. Kim went about her daily life, caring for her children and staying close to her sister's home. She jumped at unexpected sounds and watched constantly for signs of David's presence. The stress of living under threat wore on her, but she had to keep functioning for the sake of her kids. David, meanwhile, continued working and biding his time. He knew where Kim was staying. Small towns have few secrets, and Sherman was small enough that locating his estranged wife required minimal effort. He watched and waited, planning the details of what would come next. May 14, 2010, arrived as a Friday, the end of another week of tension and watchfulness. Life at Christy Salmon's house in Sherman proceeded along normal lines. Christy was in the kitchen preparing dinner. 12-year-old Lindsay sat on the living room couch. One of the boys, JC, was outside shooting basketball in the driveway. Kim was in the back of the house, running water for a bath for her younger son, DC, who was 7 years old. Benny and Melody Kirk were 3 hours away, attending a track meet with another grandchild. They had no reason to think this evening was different from any other. Their daughter and grandchildren were safe at Christie's house, protected by family and by the legal order that prohibited David from coming near them. But David had finished his workday and begun making final preparations. He stopped and purchased a .40 caliber handgun, along with 2 extra magazines of ammunition. The weapon was meant for one purpose only. Then he drove to his sister Charlotte Houston's house and borrowed a van, claiming he needed it for an errand. Charlotte had no idea her brother was about to commit murder with the vehicle she lent him. David pointed the van toward Sherman and began the 30-minute drive through rural Mississippi. He had time to reconsider, to turn around, to choose a different path. He kept driving. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, he arrived at Christy Salmon's home. Without warning or announcement, he raised his newly purchased handgun and fired through the screen door. The first gunshot shattered the quiet Friday evening at 7:00 p.m. on May 14, 2010. David Cox burst through the damaged screen door of Christy Salmon's home, weapon in hand, screaming for everyone to stay still. 9 months of planning had led to this moment, and he intended to see it through. Christy was in the kitchen when the shooting started. She heard the blast, heard her sister Kim screaming from the back of the house. Kim had been running bath water for DC when David forced his way inside. Her voice carried through the small home. "No, David, don't!" But her pleas meant nothing to a man who had spent 9 months fantasizing about this very moment. David chased Christy toward the front of the house. She fled outside, where her nephew JC was still in the driveway with his basketball. Together, aunt and nephew ran to a neighbor's house and called 911. The first emergency call was logged at 7:10 p.m., just 10 minutes after the attack began. Help was coming, but it would not arrive in time to save Kim. Inside the house, chaos gave way to calculated horror. David had shot Kim twice. One bullet struck her arm. The second tore into her abdomen, causing massive internal bleeding that would prove fatal without immediate surgery. Kim collapsed to the floor, critically wounded but still alive. She would remain alive for hours, bleeding slowly while her husband refused to let anyone help her. Lindsay had been sitting on the couch when her stepfather burst through the door. She did not witness the actual shooting, but David quickly gathered his hostages together. He forced Lindsay into the back room where her mother lay wounded and bleeding on the floor. The 12-year-old found Kim in a pool of blood, conscious but unable to move. Mama was laying on the floor. She was bleeding. Lindsay would later testify. Her younger brother DC, just 7 years old, was balled up in a closet, hiding from the violence that had erupted around him. The child could hear everything but could not understand why his father was hurting his mother. David now controlled the house with 3 hostages: his critically wounded wife, the stepdaughter he had abused for years, and his young son. Outside, police sirens began to wail in the distance. Officers from the Union County Sheriff's Department were responding to the 911 calls, but they would face a situation unlike anything they had encountered before. The first officers on scene established a perimeter around the house. Within minutes, it became clear this was not a typical domestic disturbance. An armed man had taken hostages, and at least one person inside had been shot. Sheriff Tommy White assumed command as additional units converged on the quiet residential neighborhood. The response escalated rapidly. Hostage negotiators from the Tupelo Police Department were summoned. Agents from the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation arrived to provide assistance. A helicopter appeared overhead, its searchlight cutting through the darkening sky. Multiple ambulances staged nearby, their crews ready to treat victims if given the chance. But no one could reach Kim while David held the house. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this documentary, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support allows me to keep creating in-depth content like this. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this video with anyone who appreciates true crime coverage done right. Now back to the case. Agent Chris Jones of the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation was among the first negotiators to establish contact with David Cox. He hoped to find some angle, some way to reason with the man inside. Instead, he encountered pure, undiluted rage. David cursed and screamed through the phone, making his intentions explicit. He was going to kill Kim. He was going to kill Lindsay. And if anyone tried to enter the house, he would go for headshots because he knew the officers would be wearing body armor. Officer Alan Chavers of the Tupelo Police Department took over negotiations, trying every technique he had been trained to use. He appealed to David's humanity. He emphasized the children's safety. He begged for Kim to receive the medical attention she desperately needed. The bullet in her abdomen was causing internal hemorrhaging that would kill her without surgery. Every minute mattered. David's response revealed the depths of his cruelty. He told Chavers he wanted to watch Kim die. When the negotiator continued pleading for her life, David said words that would be repeated in court testimony for years afterward. "Since you're so interested in her, I want you to hear her beg before she dies." Through the phone connection, Kim's voice could be heard in the background. She was pleading for her life, crying out in pain from her wounds, begging someone to help her. David forced the negotiators to listen to his wife's agony, using her suffering as a weapon against those trying to save her. The cruelty was deliberate and sustained. The SWAT team held position outside, ready to breach but unable to act. David had made clear that any rescue attempt would result in the children's deaths. He specifically mentioned putting a bullet in Lindsay's head multiple times. The officers faced an impossible choice: storm the house and potentially get the hostages killed, or wait and watch Kim bleed to death from wounds that could have been treated. Inside the house, David committed additional crimes that added horror upon horror. He sexually assaulted Lindsay 3 times during the hostage situation, even as her mother lay dying nearby. The abuse he had inflicted for years continued in the most nightmarish circumstances imaginable. Kim was forced to witness her daughter's assault while helpless from her own wounds. David made phone calls throughout the night, tormenting Kim's family with detailed descriptions of what he was doing. Christy Salmon had already called her parents, Benny and Melody Kirk, to tell them what was happening. The grandparents began a desperate 3-hour drive home from the track meet where they had been, knowing their daughter was in mortal danger. David called Benny Kirk while the older man was on the road. He allowed Benny to speak briefly with Kim, who was lying on the floor in tremendous pain. Benny told his daughter they were coming as fast as they could. Kim's response haunted him forever. "Daddy, I'm dying." David took the phone back and told Benny about his original plan. He had intended to kill Benny first, then Melody, then Kim's other sister, before going to Sherman and finish up and kill the rest of them. Only the fact that Benny was out of town had forced David to adjust his approach. He described shooting Kim in crude terms that demonstrated his complete lack of remorse. "I shot her, and she was bleeding like a stuck pig." When David refused to speak further with Benny Kirk, Melody became the primary family contact. David forced her into the role of reluctant negotiator, keeping her on the phone for extended periods while Kim lay dying. His hatred for the Kirk family poured through the connection throughout the long night. Through the phone, Melody could hear David mocking Kim as she bled out on the floor. The taunting never stopped, a stream of verbal cruelty directed at a woman who could not defend herself. "Are you having fun yet, you bitch?" David asked his dying wife. "Are you enjoying this? Is this fun, Kim?" Melody could do nothing but listen and try to keep David talking, hoping that somehow the standoff would end without more deaths. Every word from inside the house confirmed that Kim was still alive, but fading. Every passing hour made rescue less likely to succeed. David also called his own family members, bragging about what he had done. He spoke with his sister Charlotte Houston and her husband Michael, the same relatives from whom he had borrowed the van earlier that evening. David told them he had shot the bitch and that he wanted her to die a slow and painful death. There was no shame in his voice, no recognition of the horror he was inflicting. Michael Houston managed to speak with 7-year-old DC during one of the calls. The little boy's words captured the nightmare in the simplest terms possible. "Daddy hurt Mama." Those 3 words contained all the trauma and confusion of a child watching his family be destroyed. Throughout the night, David threatened to kill the remaining hostages if anyone attempted a rescue. The SWAT team outside had the capability to breach the house, but the risk to Lindsay and DC was too great. David knew this and used the children as shields, ensuring that his plan to watch Kim die could proceed without interference. The hours crawled past midnight and into the early morning of May 15, 2010. Kim's condition deteriorated steadily as internal bleeding continued without treatment. The ambulances staged outside remained useless, their crews powerless to help a victim they could not reach. Negotiators kept trying to find some approach that might work, but David had not come to negotiate. The last confirmed sign that Kim was still alive came sometime after midnight. She had been conscious and responsive for more than 5 hours after being shot, enduring pain that is difficult to imagine. She had spoken with her father, knowing it was likely the last time they would ever talk. She had watched her daughter be assaulted while unable to protect her. And throughout it all, David had made sure she knew exactly why this was happening, blaming her for his imprisonment even as he took her life. At some point in those dark hours before dawn, Kim Kirk Cox stopped breathing. The 40-year-old mother of 3 had bled to death on her sister's floor, surrounded by her children, but powerless to save them from the man who had once promised to help raise them. David had achieved his goal. He had watched his wife die. The standoff continued even after Kim's death. David still held the children as hostages, still had his weapons, still posed a threat. The negotiators outside did not know exactly when Kim had died or whether there might still be a chance to save her. They continued their efforts through the remaining hours of darkness. As night turned toward dawn, the SWAT team prepared for tactical entry. Waiting longer served no purpose. Kim was beyond saving, and the children remained in danger every moment they stayed in that house with David. At 3:23 a.m. on May 15, 2010, the officers moved. The breach was successful. SWAT team members entered the house with weapons ready, prepared for a firefight. But David Cox offered no resistance. Perhaps he was exhausted after the night's events. Perhaps he had accomplished what he set out to do and saw no point in further violence. Perhaps he simply lacked the courage to face armed officers after hours of terrorizing women and children. Whatever the reason, he surrendered without firing another shot. Emergency medical personnel finally reached Kim Cox, but there was nothing to be done. She had been dead for hours, her body cold, all signs of life long extinguished. The cause of death was blood loss from gunshot wounds, but the true cause was the hatred of a man who refused to accept responsibility for his own crimes. David had not simply shot Kim. He had let her bleed for 8 hours while refusing to allow help. David Cox was placed in handcuffs and led to a waiting patrol car. He had nothing to say as officers processed the scene. The threats, the taunts, the cruel phone calls throughout the night were all recorded and would serve as evidence. His guilt was not in question. Multiple witnesses had heard him confess to the shooting in real time. Union County Sheriff Tommy White announced publicly that his department would seek the death penalty. Given the nature of the crimes, the prolonged torture of the victim, and the sexual assaults on a child, no lesser penalty seemed appropriate. David Cox had committed murder in the most aggravated circumstances possible. The crime scene told the full story of what had happened. Blood evidence documented Kim's prolonged suffering. Shell casings matched the weapon David had purchased just hours before the attack. The recordings of phone conversations captured his confessions and his cruelty in his own words. J.C., the son who had escaped with his aunt at the beginning, was reunited with his traumatized siblings. The 3 children had lost their mother and witnessed their father's true nature in a single, horrible night. They would need years to process what had happened, and some wounds would never fully heal. Benny and Melody Kirk arrived to find their daughter dead and their grandchildren orphaned. The retired law enforcement officer had spent his career dealing with violence and its aftermath. Nothing had prepared him for this. His own son-in-law had murdered his daughter while Benny drove desperately through the night, unable to arrive in time. David Neal Cox was booked into the Union County Jail on the morning of May 15, 2010, facing 8 charges including capital murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of sexual battery, burglary, and firing into a dwelling. The investigation that followed was straightforward because the evidence was overwhelming. Crime scene analysis, shell casings matched to David's weapon, and recordings from the 8-hour hostage negotiation all documented his crimes in detail. Family members who received phone calls during the standoff provided statements, and David's former cellmates came forward to testify that he had announced his intention to kill Kim during his 9 months in jail. The most difficult testimony came from 12-year-old Lindsay Kirk, who described the sexual assaults in a recorded forensic interview. The criminal case against David Neal Cox moved through the Union County court system over the next 2 years. The charges were serious, the evidence overwhelming, and the punishment being sought was death. Defense attorneys faced the impossible task of representing a client who had confessed to his crimes in recorded phone calls that would be played for any jury. In September 2012, more than 2 years after the murder, David Cox appeared in the Union County Courthouse in New Albany, Mississippi. The case had attracted significant attention throughout northeastern Mississippi. Kim's murder, with its 8 hours of torture and the sexual assaults on her daughter, had shocked communities that thought they knew what evil looked like. Rather than force a trial where his guilt would be proven beyond any doubt, David made a decision that surprised some observers. On September 17, 2012, he pleaded guilty to all 8 charges against him. There was no plea bargain, no deal that would take the death penalty off the table. David simply admitted to capital murder, kidnapping, sexual battery, burglary, and firing into a dwelling. The guilty pleas did not end the proceedings. Mississippi law required a sentencing trial for capital murder convictions, even when the defendant admitted guilt. A jury would be impaneled to hear evidence and decide whether David Cox should be executed or spend the rest of his life in prison. The trial phase began immediately after his guilty pleas were entered. Prosecutors presented their case methodically over 5 days. Police officers described the scene when they finally entered the house at 3:23 a.m. Investigators presented the physical evidence collected from the crime scene. The 911 operator played recordings of the initial emergency calls. Agent Chris Jones testified about his attempts to negotiate with David. Officer Alan Chavers described David's statements about wanting to watch Kim die. The jury heard recordings of Kim Cox pleading for her life while her husband refused to let help reach her. The audio was devastating, capturing human cruelty in its rawest form. Family members took the stand to describe the phone calls they received during the standoff. Benny Kirk told the jury about his final conversation with his daughter. The words, "Daddy, I'm dying," seared into his memory. Melody Kirk recounted hours of being forced to listen to David taunt his dying wife. David's former cellmates testified about the threats he had made during his 9 months in jail. They told the jury that David had repeatedly announced his intention to kill Kim. The murder was not an act of sudden passion. It was planned, anticipated, and discussed with multiple people before it happened. Lindsay Kirk's forensic interview was shown to the jury. The recording captured a 12-year-old girl describing sexual assault by her stepfather while her mother lay dying on the floor. The testimony was almost unbearable to hear, evidence of trauma that would last a lifetime. The defense presented witnesses who tried to humanize David Cox. His neighbors spoke about knowing him as a friend. His sisters described the brother they remembered from family gatherings. An expert in drug and alcohol dependency discussed substance abuse issues. A psychiatrist offered testimony about David's mental state. But nothing the defense presented could overcome the evidence of what David had done. The recordings of his own voice, the testimony of his own family members, the wounds inflicted on a child he was supposed to protect. After 5 days of testimony, the jury was ready to decide. On September 22, 2012, the jury in Union County, Mississippi, returned its verdict. After hearing 5 days of testimony and deliberating on the appropriate punishment, they reached a unanimous decision. David Neal Cox should be executed for the capital murder of Kim Kirk Cox. The death sentence was based on aggravating factors that made the crime especially heinous. David had killed Kim during the commission of other felonies, including kidnapping and sexual assault. He had let her bleed for 8 hours rather than allowing medical treatment that might have saved her life. He had sexually assaulted his stepdaughter 3 times as his wife lay dying. The jury found that these circumstances warranted the ultimate punishment. In addition to the death sentence for capital murder, David received additional prison time for the other charges. He was sentenced to 30 years for each count of kidnapping, totaling 60 years. He received 30 years for each count of sexual battery, totaling 90 years. Burglary added 25 years, and firing into a dwelling added 10 more. The total additional sentence was 185 years, to be served consecutively with the death sentence. Judge Kent Smith entered the sentencing order in accordance with the jury's verdict. David Cox was remanded to the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections to await execution. He would be transferred to the state penitentiary at Parchman, where death row inmates were housed in isolation from the general prison population. The Kirk family did not celebrate the verdict. Justice had been served according to the law, but Kim was still dead. 3 children had lost their mother. Lindsay had endured trauma that would affect her entire life. No sentence, however severe, could undo the harm David had caused. Benny and Melody Kirk focused on their grandchildren rather than on revenge or closure. The 3 kids needed stability, love, and support as they tried to rebuild their lives. The grandparents stepped into the role of primary caregivers, providing the kind of home environment that Kim would have wanted for her children. Lindsay Kirk began the long process of healing from years of abuse, followed by the ultimate trauma of her mother's murder. She was now being raised by her grandparents, surrounded by people who loved her and believed in her resilience. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to survive. The 2 boys, DC and JC, were still young enough that they might not fully understand what had happened. But they knew their mother was gone, and their father had killed her. That knowledge would shape their development in ways that no one could fully predict. After the sentencing, David was transferred to the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. The sprawling prison complex in the Mississippi Delta would be his home for the foreseeable future. Death row at Parchman was notorious for harsh conditions, but David had ensured his own fate through his actions on the night of May 14, 2010, Mississippi law provided for automatic appeals in death penalty cases. David's attorneys would file challenges to his conviction and sentence, raising legal issues about trial procedures and constitutional questions about capital punishment. The appeals process could take years or even decades to resolve. Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman was the oldest and largest prison in the state. Built on the site of a former plantation in the Mississippi Delta, it occupied roughly 28 square miles of flat agricultural land. The prison had housed some of Mississippi's most dangerous criminals since the late 1800s, and death row was located in Unit 29, a maximum security section isolated from other inmates. David Cox arrived at Parchman following his sentencing in September 2012. For the next 9 years, this sprawling complex would be his entire world. He was confined to a small cell, isolated from other inmates for most of each day, with limited access to programs or activities. Death row was designed for punishment, not rehabilitation. The conditions at Parchman were notorious throughout the state and beyond. The cells lacked air conditioning in a region where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Inmates sometimes stripped to their underwear just to cope with the suffocating heat. Inside the concrete buildings, temperatures could reach 145 degrees on the hottest days. Beyond the heat, prisoners faced other hardships. Some inmates reported being bitten by rats. The drinking water was sometimes brown and visibly contaminated. Medical care was inadequate, with prisoners forced to treat their own wounds or go without necessary medication. Staff shortages meant guards were spread thin, unable to respond quickly to emergencies or prevent violence between inmates. The Department of Justice launched an investigation into Parchman in February 2020, following a series of violent incidents. In the first few months of that year alone, at least 16 inmates died at Mississippi prisons, including multiple homicides and suicides. The investigation found systemic violations of prisoners' constitutional rights, documenting conditions that failed to meet basic standards of humane treatment. For David Cox, these conditions took their toll over the years. While he had initially allowed his attorneys to file appeals challenging his conviction and sentence, his attitude began to shift. The prospect of spending decades in the misery of Parchman, fighting legal battles that seemed unlikely to succeed, lost its appeal. Death began to seem preferable to continued existence in such circumstances. During his time on death row, David's automatic appeals made their way through the court system. On February 3, 2015, the Mississippi Supreme Court heard his first appeal. He raised 9 issues challenging various aspects of his trial, from venue to jury instructions to the admission of certain evidence. On June 25, 2015, the court rejected all of his arguments. The conviction and death sentence were affirmed. David filed a second appeal, which the Mississippi Supreme Court also rejected on February 16, 2016. His attorneys pursued post-conviction relief through other legal channels, continuing to fight the death penalty on his behalf, even as David himself began questioning whether he wanted to keep fighting. The years passed slowly in Unit 29. David watched other inmates come and go, some winning appeals, some dying from violence or illness, some simply enduring as he was. The harshness of Parchman ground down everyone who spent time there, and David was no exception. By 2018, he had made a decision that would set him apart from most death row inmates. Rather than continue fighting for his life, David Cox would ask the state to execute him. He would become what prison officials called a volunteer, a condemned man who waived his appeals and accepted his sentence. In July 2018, David Cox wrote a letter to the trial judge, the district attorney, and his lawyer that revealed his unchanged hatred even years after the crime. The letter admitted guilt and stated he would kill Kim again if given the opportunity. Using crude language and poor spelling, David wrote that if he could, he would dig up his dead sarcastic wife and, with eager pleasure, kill the fat heathen whore again. He stated he would do it again and again, happily if chance was given. This was not the statement of a remorseful man seeking mercy. It was the declaration of someone who remained proud of murder. The following month, David sent another letter to the Mississippi Supreme Court. This time, he asked to fire his attorneys, waive all his remaining appeals, and proceed immediately to execution. He wrote that he was a guilty man worthy of death, and requested the court to grant his plea without further delay. David raised an unusual religious argument in support of his request. He claimed to have converted to the Anabaptist faith, specifically Old Order Amish, and argued that having lawyers conflicted with his religious beliefs. Whether this conversion was genuine or merely a legal strategy remains unclear. What is clear is that David consistently expressed a desire to stop fighting his sentence and accept execution. His attorneys at the Mississippi office of Capital Post-Conviction Counsel faced an ethical dilemma. They had an obligation to advocate for their clients' interests, but David was telling them to stop fighting on his behalf. When David first expressed his desire to waive appeals, they filed a motion on his behalf to withdraw the request. David signed an affidavit claiming he had been depressed and had not been on antidepressant medication. But within months, David changed his position again. In November 2018, he filed another motion asking to dismiss his appeals and his attorneys. He wrote that he was of very sound mind and will, and that he remained worthy of death. The courts would need to determine whether David was competent to make such a profound decision about his own life. The Mississippi Supreme Court ordered a competency hearing to evaluate David's mental state. On February 11, 2021, the hearing took place before Judge Kent Smith. 2 mental health experts testified about David's psychological condition. Family members and friends provided information about his background. David himself took the stand to explain his reasoning. David spoke clearly about his desire to end his appeals. He admitted his guilt without reservation. He talked about his religious beliefs and his wish to bring closure to his children and to Kim's family. He stated he was ready for immediate execution and understood what that meant. The mental health experts found that David understood his legal situation. He knew what options were available to him. He comprehended that waiving appeals would result in his death. He was making a rational choice, even if others might disagree with it. On April 5, 2021, Judge Smith ruled that David Cox was mentally competent to waive his appeals. The court found that David's decision was the product of a reasonable assessment of all available options. David's attorneys appealed this ruling, but on October 21, 2021, the Mississippi Supreme Court upheld the decision. Chief Justice Michael Randolph wrote that the record resoundingly evinces Cox's waiver was made intelligently and understandingly, knowing full well the end result would be sure and certain death. The execution date was set for November 17, 2021, at 6 o'clock in the evening. With his execution date confirmed, David Cox had less than a month to live. During those final weeks, he made a decision that would bring closure to a family that had waited 14 years for answers. He was ready to confess to another murder. In late October 2021, David contacted his attorneys with information he had kept secret for more than a decade. He told them about Felicia Cox, his sister-in-law who had disappeared on July 2, 2007. He admitted that he had killed her. He provided detailed instructions on where investigators could find her remains. He drew a hand-drawn map showing the burial location on land that had once belonged to Felicia's own family. For 14 years, Felicia's daughter Amber Miskelly had lived without knowing what happened to her mother. She had been just 18 when Felicia vanished after visiting David's home. Amber could not properly grieve because there was no confirmation of death. She could not move on because faint hope still flickered. The uncertainty had been its own form of torture, stretching on year after year. David waived his attorney-client privilege, but only effective upon his death. This meant the confession could not be used against him while he was alive, though that point was moot since he was already facing execution anyway. The information would be delivered to prosecutors after David was dead. Prosecutors offered David immunity in exchange for disclosing the location of Felicia's body. Since David was already condemned, the immunity had no practical effect. The offer was a legal formality that allowed the process to proceed within established procedures. The confession answered the question of what had happened to Felicia, but left other questions forever unanswered. David admitted to killing her, but never explained why. He never described how she died or what led to the murder. The motive remained unknown, and David showed no intention of sharing those details. On the eve of his execution, David was transferred from death row to Unit 17, the section of Parchman specifically designated for executions. The unit was isolated, surrounded by fencing and guard towers, accessible only by a single road. David would spend his final days there, preparing to face the consequences of his crimes. Corrections Commissioner Burl Cain visited David during his final days. The commissioner reported that David appeared calm and showed some signs of remorse, though his July 2018 letter suggested otherwise. David expressed a desire for closure, both for his own children and for Kim's family. Whether this represented genuine change or merely resignation to his fate is impossible to know. David shared his final meal with Commissioner Cain and several other officials. The meal consisted of fried catfish, French fries, cornbread, and banana pudding. It was simple Southern food, the kind of meal David might have eaten growing up in the Mississippi Delta. Before the execution, David asked his attorneys to communicate a message to his sons after his death. He wanted them to know that he loved them and that he had been a good man at one time. He also asked his attorneys to speak publicly about the conditions at Parchman, explaining how the horrible living conditions made his decision to give up his appeals very easy. November 17, 2021, dawned cool and breezy in the Mississippi Delta. A strong wind blew across the flat landscape surrounding Parchman Prison as journalists and witnesses gathered for what would be the state's first execution in 9 years. Mississippi had not put anyone to death since Gary Carl Simmons in 2012, and David Cox's case had drawn significant attention. Governor Tate Reeves declined all requests for clemency or delay. His office issued a statement noting that David had admitted to horrific crimes on multiple occasions and had been found competent to waive his appeals by both the trial court and the Mississippi Supreme Court. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Opposition groups had tried to stop the execution through various means. Death penalty action argued that killing an inmate who had waived his appeals amounted to state-sponsored suicide. More than 4,600 people signed a petition asking the governor to intervene. The Mississippi Rising Coalition held a prayer vigil at the prison gates. None of these efforts changed the outcome. Among the witnesses who gathered at Unit 17 was Lindsay Kirk. Now 23 years old, she had come to watch the man who murdered her mother and abused her throughout her childhood face the ultimate consequence. She had initially been unhappy when she learned David wanted to expedite his execution. "I kind of just wanted him to sit there," she had said, referring to her wish that he suffer longer in Parchman's harsh conditions. But she had accepted the outcome and wanted to be present. Also present were 3 attorneys from the Mississippi Office of Capital Post-Conviction Counsel. David had specifically requested that the lawyers who had represented him witness his death. They took their places in the front row of the witness room. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the curtain in the execution chamber began to rise. David Cox lay strapped to a gurney, his arms extended to his sides with intravenous tubes inserted in both wrists. His 6'2" frame was covered by a white sheet up to his chest. He wore a red prison jumpsuit beneath the sheet. Commissioner Cain stood beside David during the procedure. The commissioner had witnessed many executions during his previous tenure as warden of Louisiana's Angola prison. He would guide David through his final moments and ensure the process proceeded according to protocol. When asked if he had any last words, David spoke clearly. "I want my children to know that I love them very much and that I was a good man at one time. Don't ever read anything but the King James Bible, and I want to thank the Commissioner for being so kind to me. And that's all I got to say. At 6:10 p.m. precisely, the lethal drugs began flowing into David's body. Mississippi used a 3-drug protocol: midazolam as a sedative, vecuronium bromide to paralyze the muscles, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. The source of the drugs was concealed under Mississippi's secrecy law. David took several deep breaths after the injection began. His mouth moved slightly as the drugs took effect. Then he was still. At 6:12 p.m., a coroner pronounced David Neal Cox dead at the age of 50, 2 weeks short of his 51st birthday. He had spent 9 years on death row, 11 years since he killed Kim Cox. Commissioner Kane addressed reporters afterward. "He died peacefully and without incident." Kane said, "You couldn't make it more picture-perfect than we had tonight. I've never seen an execution go smoother." 2 days after David Cox's execution, attorneys from the Office of Capital Post-Conviction Counsel delivered a sealed envelope to District Attorney John Weddle. Inside was the letter David had written, confessing to the murder of Felicia Cox, along with the hand-drawn map showing where her body was buried. The confession activated an investigation that had been cold for 14 years. Prosecutors now had specific information about a specific location. They assembled a team of investigators, forensic specialists, and archaeologists to search for Felicia's remains. On December 6, 2021, District Attorney Weddle held a press conference at the Pontotoc County Courthouse. He confirmed the existence of David's confession and announced that a search operation would begin soon. He cautioned that finding the remains was not guaranteed, despite the detailed information David had provided. The search team included members of the Pontotoc County Sheriff's Department, investigators from the District Attorney's Office, and experts from Mississippi State University's Departments of Archaeology and Anthropology. They brought ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery comparing the site's appearance in 2007 to its current state, and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. Using David's map and the technical resources available to them, investigators identified a search area on Cane Creek Road in Pontotoc County. The land had once belonged to Felicia's family before passing through other hands. Her abandoned car had been found about 2 miles from this location 14 years earlier. On Sunday, December 12, 2021, the search began. Amber Miskelly, Felicia's daughter, was present at the site. She had waited 14 years to learn what happened to her mother. Now 32 years old, Amber watched as investigators methodically worked through the search area. The team used radar equipment to identify areas where the ground had been disturbed. They removed soil carefully, layer by layer, preserving any evidence they might encounter. Cadaver dogs were brought in periodically to check for signs of human remains. After more than 2 hours of digging, the search team found what they were looking for. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, human remains were uncovered at the location David had indicated in his map. The body had been buried there for 14 years, hidden beneath Mississippi soil, while Felicia's family wondered what had happened to her. District Attorney Weddle issued a statement expressing gratitude to everyone involved in the discovery. "We are thankful the family can now begin the process of giving Felicia Cox a burial," he said. Amber Miskelly was present when authorities informed her they had found remains believed to be her mother. A member of the Pontotoc County Sheriff's Department embraced her as she received the news. After 14 years of uncertainty, she finally had confirmation that her mother was dead and could be laid to rest. The remains were transported to the State Crime Laboratory for autopsy and DNA testing. On December 23, 2021, authorities confirmed that the remains belonged to Felicia Cox. The identification was made by matching DNA samples from the remains with samples from Felicia's daughter. David Cox had taken most of his secrets to the grave, but he had given Felicia's family the one thing they needed most: the ability to bury their loved one and begin the process of true closure. The discovery of Felicia Cox's remains answered the question of what had happened to her, but left others forever unanswered. David never explained why he killed his sister-in-law. He never described how she died or what preceded the murder. The motive remained a mystery even after his confession. Felicia had visited David's home on July 6, 2007, planning to get a ride to see her incarcerated husband. Something happened during that visit that led to her death. David was capable of violence, as he proved 3 years later when he murdered Kim. But what triggered his attack on Felicia remains unknown. The execution of David Cox brought legal closure, but not emotional closure for those he had harmed. The families of his 2 victims were left to process grief that would never fully heal. The children he orphaned faced futures shaped by trauma they did not choose and could not escape. David Neal Cox was executed on November 17, 2021, the first person put to death in Mississippi in 9 years. He was 50 years old.